So greetings to all of you and welcome to the BRICS Academic Forum. If I can request the speakers to switch on their video as well. You can be on mute, but at least make sure your videos are on so I can see you. I'm Mohan Kumar and I spent 36 years in the Indian Foreign Service, retired as India's ambassador to Paris. Last 4 years, I'm more of an academic and I head a think tank, which is called Research and Information System for Developing Countries. I'm sure some of you are aware of this institution, and we are extremely happy to be partnering with ORF, the Observer Research Foundation, to do this program today. So the program today, or the session today, is trade and resilient supply chains. I wanted to begin by saying that the BRICS formally met between 12th and 14th of July. We are talking just a week ago, and they discussed trade, and they came up with 2 or 3 points which are actionable. And if I can request the speakers, if possible, to address this. One is cooperation in the multilateral trading system, which is essentially WTO, but also UNCTAD and so on. And in the WTO, you do know that the most interesting things being discussed there are the TRIPS waiver. You've got the fishery subsidies agreement, and generally the future of the WTO in the run-up to the 12th ministerial conference in December. So that's one actionable point, if I can request the speakers to speak to that. The second is obviously tariff and non-tariff barriers. In the context of TBT and SPS agreement, there are lots of issues between BRICS members, and if you can focus a little bit on that if you wish. But otherwise, the resilient supply chains are arguably the most important subject, and that's certainly the flavor of the season. Everybody is talking resilient supply chains. The interesting thing is, I'm not sure they're talking about the same thing. But in the context of BRICS, it's interesting that if you take vaccines, for example, it's not as if we are short of manufacturing capacity. I was struck by the manufacturing capacity of India, China, and Russia. So there are countries where there is abundant manufacturing capacity for vaccines. So when we talk of resilient supply chains, and everyone knows this is not the last pandemic, I think we could look for cooperation in this area. And of course, pharmaceutical products, medical devices, personal protective equipment, all this will be resilient supply chain. If you want to go away from health, public health, and talk of resilient supply chain in other areas, that is fine too. So with those words, I just wanted to repeat my plea to you that if speakers can speak between 5 and 6 minutes, I will give you a polite indication when your 5 minutes is up, so that we can have more time for interaction. Let me begin with my colleague. So Flavio, I'm going to give you the floor. You're the first. You are a researcher with the Institute for Applied Economic Research from Brazil. A great pleasure to have you. I have very fond memories of negotiating with Brazilian diplomats in the WTO, but I also know that I retired 4 years ago, and since then Brazil has chosen not to be a developing country. So some important changes have happened in your country as well. So over to you, Flavio.
Thank you, Ambassador Kumar. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In this brief opening statement, I'll try to be brief as asked by Ambassador Kumar, and I'll try to speak a bit more generally about resilience and policies that aim to obtain it. First, I would like to call your attention to 2 relevant aspects that I believe that should be part of our discussion about the effects of the pandemic on global value chains and how to keep them as resilient as possible. The first one is the relationship between fragmented or globalized production and the vulnerability to shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic. One very frequent diagnostic about this relationship is that the participation in global value chains increases the exposure to shocks. And so the solution will be to reshore production or decouple from these global value chains in order to avoid the disruption that these kinds of shocks cause. That there is, however, broad evidence that this diagnostic is not correct. There is an increasing set of recent studies that shows that, first of all, that decoupling does not necessarily decrease the risks of exposures to shocks. For example, even if decoupling can decrease the exposure to external shocks and insulate a country from these external shocks, it vastly increases the risk associated to local and domestic shocks. So the participation in global value chains, they work as a mechanism for diversifying risk. And though it can actually improve the resilience of supply chains in moments of crisis, instead of relying exclusively on domestic inputs. And moreover, if we would like to assess the costs and benefits of these two strategies, the participating in globalized value chains in one side or localized supply chains in the other, we must contrast the welfare costs associated. We must contrast the welfare costs associated with higher contagion via global value chains, which we experienced recently, with the potential welfare gains that would not be reaped in the absence of these interconnectedness. And there is also mounting evidence that the latter, the potential welfare gains that would not be reaped without the GVCs, is much larger than the costs of contagion via GVCs. And so to get rid of this interconnectedness and of the fragmented production, in order to avoid this cost of shock transmission, will amount to throwing the baby away with the bathwater. The second point I would like to highlight regards the policy mechanisms adopted by governments around the world to minimize the negative effects of the pandemic on national economies. As it is very frequent in global crisis, these measures that are usually taken are kind of emergency beggar thy neighbor policies. And as expected, they will be no more effective and no less harmful than traditional beggar thy neighbor policies. One example is in the last year's report from Global Trade Alert. It shows that if we look at the measures adopted by the G20 countries, in order to the trade-related measures adopted by G20 countries, the report shows that more than 3/4 of all these trade-related measures harm the trading partners of the countries that took them. So usually the measures that governments take in times of crisis are essentially protectionist and try to insulate their countries from these effects. And as they stress in this report, it is about time that we abandon the idea that we should suspend the trade rule book in times of crisis, what we euphemistically call flexibility or policy space. We instead should start to design new rules that are adequate for these critical periods. For example, why doesn't the WTO have emergency protocols that start to operate in times of crisis, like the WHO has? In these kinds of global trade crises, what we need is more and better coordination and not more flexibility.
Flavio, you have
So,
2 minutes. You have 2 minutes to
okay,
conclude. Thank you.
okay, no problem. Thank you. So instead of these protectionist beggar thy neighbor policies that aim on national insulation, these emergency measures to cope with trade-related impacts of sanitary crises such as the COVID-19 should be thought of and should be designed as insurance mechanisms whose objective is to smooth out the effects of the shock. We can think of it in the same way yet as policies that focus not on restoring output levels, which was not possible, but on smoothing the time path of consumption. For example, through temporary income problems that were financed by debt. And finally, it is likely true that the COVID crisis will lead to changes in the geographical patterns of production. However, this change is not likely to point inwards, but rather towards more diversification of suppliers, flexibility, and modularity of supply chains. And public policy should help this change and not hinder it. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavio. To save time, I'm not going to summarize what each speaker has said because that will eat into our time. But certainly, I would request other speakers to also react to what other speakers are saying. So when your turn comes to speak, kindly feel free to react to what others have said so that we can try and make it as interactive as possible. Ms. Olga Onomareva is Research Fellow at the Institute of International Economics and Finance from Russia. And Ms. Olga, you have the mic. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Flavio, for your speech and for your thoughts and views on the functioning of global value chains in terms of pandemic. And I absolutely agree that the openness and not the protectionism, but vice versa, more open views on cooperation in the framework of GVCs is the right way and the right source for resilience and for more stable functioning of our trading system. But in my intervention, I would like to concentrate on some specific aspects of global value chains functioning today. And of course, COVID pandemic revealed the vulnerability of existing supply chains, but at the same time, it intensified the technological development of global value chains. And these developments, as I see them, if they are adequately implemented, can also be the source of resilience. And of course, implemented in terms of international cooperation as well. And first of all, I would like to comment on these fundamental processes in world economy that are attributed to digitalization in context of global value chains. We see at least two important trends. And first of all, it is the digitalization of services and services trade. And the second one is automatization and robotization of production stages of global value chains. As for digitalization of services, it results in the situation when significant proportion of value added is generated on services intensive stages of global value chains. They are research and development, product concept development, design, engineering, and so forth. And of course, it makes supply of services more geographically independent on other stages, and GVCs tend to be more fragmented and more global, of course. So here it is a great potential for BRICS cooperation, especially taking into account the positive dynamics of digitally deliverable services trade in BRICS economies. And this creates even more incentives. So let me turn to the second aspect. It is automatization, and the application of industrial robots results in increase in productivity and value added, specifically in the stages of manufacturing, assembly, packaging, and such stages of production. These are strong arguments for the growing investments in automatization of production. But not only this factor matters. Cooperation in this sphere within global value chains can help to remove imbalances in access to high-end technologies and narrow the digital divide that we witness not only internationally but within our countries as well. And today, such countries as Singapore, Republic of Korea, these countries are leading economies in this sphere. As far as I'm concerned, among BRICS, China is the leading economy this year, but all other member countries also have great potential. As COVID pandemic demonstrated, the significance of digitalization and technological development of production and GVCs is very high. So more digitalized industries found themselves in a less risky position. The same is true for automated manufacturing. However, the degree of fragmentation and geographical spread of GVCs played, of course, a reverse role. As lockdowns and other restrictive measures led to the disruptions in communication and interaction between different stages. The development of digital economy and technologies heavily depends on government policy and investment strategies. And here I also I would like to stress that government policy is the key instrument here, not only the business incentive and business strategies. And in this case, BRICS cooperation may become an important part of realization, the international part of these policies and strategies, national policies and strategies to build more flexible, diversified, digitalized and resilient global value chains and within the BRICS region as well.
And Miss Olga, 2 minutes more.
2 minutes more. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just some conclusions on the ways where we can cooperate in these specific areas. BRICS economies may increase value added generated within our GVCs and improve competitiveness through development of technological cooperation, implementation of joint research and development projects. Also, it is true for the sharing the experience on implementation of automation and robotization technologies and industrial enterprises and some other contemporary high-tech issues. Our countries can cooperate in the field of digital services, and it is very important to ensure the possibility of transferring some stages of global value chains into the digital space, reducing the risk of physical supply chain disruptions. And at last, I would like to mention that BRICS cooperation in digital services may ensure communication and transparency and facilitate trade operations. The activities of digital platforms, software provisions, payments, dispute resolutions, and all of these things that now transferred to digital space through platforms. And here we also may see good results in cooperation between our countries, between our business communities. Thank you. Here I stop.
Thank you, Ms. Olga. It's my pleasure now to request Dr. Tanya, Assistant Professor of School of International Trade and Economics, Research of Center BRICS Studies, University of International Business and Economics in China. Dr. Ya, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. I'm very glad to join in this session. And maybe it's the second time to meet some of the colleagues. I mainly study econ, so I would like to share my opinions based on some recent econ findings. First, I would like to give some numerical evidence that a significant part of pandemic influence is transmitted through global value chain. Then I would like to discuss how we deal with resilient supply chain, our topic. Okay, as is well known, we are now in the era of globalization. There are worries that COVID-19 and pandemic control policies could generate shock waves transmitted via global value chains and cause economic costs across national borders. Taking China, for example, in the first quarter of 2020, as COVID-19 cases peaked in China at that time, total Chinese exports fell by 9.3% quarter on quarter. This is the largest fall in a decade for China. I would like to mention a recent working paper by four Chinese researchers, Han Mingfang, Chun Miange, Han Wei-Huang, and Hongbin Li. They decomposed the economic influence of COVID-19 in China into several mechanisms, including effects of domestic pandemic in China, effects of pandemic in trading partners, and effects of policies in response to the pandemic. Here I'll briefly introduce their main findings. They used the number of job postings to measure the local labor market of China, which is also a good measure to evaluate the economic loss caused by COVID-19. According to their estimation, in the first 14 weeks after the Wuhan lockdown on January 23, 2020 in China, the number of newly posted jobs dropped by about 31%. This is a very large drop in labor demand relative to the same lunar calendar period in 2018 and 2019. Domestically, they find that the effect of COVID-19 cases in other parts of China on the local labor market is similar to that in the local city. Okay, this suggests that for large countries like China, our BRICS countries, these countries have complex domestic supply chains. And for these countries, a nationally coordinated strategy is very important for controlling both the pandemic and economic activities. With the pandemic under control in China, the impacts of global pandemic through trade and pandemic mitigation policies have become more prominent over time. As evident from their analysis, 7 weeks after Wuhan's lockdown, 78% of the loss of new jobs in China was due to foreign pandemic shocks via the global supply chain. This finding suggests that an open economy cannot fully recover unless the pandemic is well under control among all of its major trading partners, and thus international coordination in pandemic control is very crucial. Now, border control policies might lead to renationalization of supply chains, as I agree, as we can see now in the world. However, this only means a shift from foreign intermediates to domestic intermediates, which are also very severely disrupted by domestic lockdown policies. So in the current situation, to improve resilient supply chain in the global view, I think, first, international cooperation in fighting COVID-19 is very essential, like reallocating vaccines and medical supplies. Second, tariff and other trade barriers should be further lowered down, so more negotiations on free trade are expected. Third, maintaining trust between trade partners is essential. We may even encourage foreign suppliers first when the cost is in a reasonable range. This is for the long-run benefit of maintaining global supply chain, not for the short-run benefit. Okay, this is my main views and the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tanya, and I will come back to you at the time of discussion, and then we can pick up on some of the points you made. I just have one request for you, if it's possible. You cited a research study by 3 Chinese researchers. It would be very helpful if you can post the link on the chat box or send the link to our organizers later so that some of us can access it. Thank you. Thank you very much for your intervention. I now request Mr. Cyril Prinsloo, Senior Researcher, South African Institute of International Affairs from South Africa. You have the mic, sir.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's a great privilege for me to join this esteemed panel. I think, as many of our colleagues very rightly pointed out, over the past 18 months to 2 years since the global pandemic, we've seen unprecedented supply chain disruptions across the world. As some of our colleagues have alluded to, whether that's supply and demand side disruptions or whether it's that geopolitical element around GVC nationalism, trade protectionism. I think an important dynamic to this, or important dimension to this conversation, is also what happened to supply chains within the BRICS, right? So, we've been working for the past 10, 15 odd years to strengthen the resilience, the economic ties between the BRICS countries. And I think that's what a lot of my research has focused, and which I also want to share today with colleagues and bring that dimension to this discussion. And I think I'm going to talk to a couple of graphs, and the organizers has told me that they'll share these graphs with our audience. So please feel free to refer to those. But essentially what I looked at over the past 18 months is trade flows, imports, exports between the BRICS countries. How did those trade flows hold up amidst all these supply and demand disruptions, etc.? And I think the one thing that we see is that there was clearly a very steep downturn in trade between the BRICS countries at the outset of the pandemic. But what we found eventually, there was a very quick recovery from around June 2020 onwards. And I think for me, that's very encouraging. If we talk about resilience of supply chains, I think that's also testament to BRICS cooperation over the past 10, 15 odd years. That very sharp recovery. And in fact, if we look at trade flows over the last month or so, they've exceeded what it was pre-pandemic, which is certainly encouraging. Nevertheless, I think there's always scope for us to further strengthen the resilience of trade between the BRICS countries, to further deepen our economic cooperation. And I think the key here is last year under Russia's chairship, we saw the development of the strategy for BRICS Economic Partnership 2025, which essentially gives us the framework for cooperation, economic cooperation between the group. I think what we would very much like to see this year under India's chairship is creating an action plan for that strategy, creating the action plan that will allow for the implementation of that strategy. And I think the thing that we ask ourselves, what should be included in an action plan? And I think Ambassador Kumar, at the start of this conversation, you very much alluded, when it comes to tariffs, non-tariff barriers, that action plan needs to have the mechanisms for our countries to address those tariff or non-tariff barriers. I think the action plan also needs to facilitate statistical data, importantly, not just at an intergovernmental level, but more critically at a business level, whether it's market opportunities or business opportunities. I think importantly, an action plan should also facilitate cooperation between stakeholders. And I think here, not just, again, at a governmental, at a business level, but equally across different spheres of society, so that we can have inclusive, sustainable value chains that supports our trade. I think joint proposals, pilot projects would really help us move forward this agenda in terms of building those resilient value chains within the BRICS. And then, of course, exchange of experiences. Our colleague from Russia earlier mentioned around inclusion of digital services into value chains, how that can build resilience. Certainly, there's scope for us as BRICS to learn from each other in that regard. I think the other important dimension to building resilient value chains within the BRICS is increasing investment between the BRICS. And again, if I can refer the audience to download the graphs, it's basically if we look at investment flows between the BRICS, there's certainly an uptick over the last 10, 15 odd years. I think in the case of South Africa, incoming investment from Brazil, Russia, India, China has also significantly increased, again, which is encouraging. Nevertheless, I think there's scope for us to increase that investment from BRICS counterparts into South Africa and vice versa. I think latest statistics shows that 20% of South Africa's, roughly 20% of South Africa's total trade is with our BRICS counterparts, but only around 5% of foreign direct investment comes from the BRICS. So certainly there's scope to improve that. Again, if we look at the strategy for BRICS economic partnership, I think as we look towards creating that action plan, investment promotion should certainly be a central pillar of that action plan. Exploring, whether it's de-risking mechanisms, incentive programs, promotion of joint ventures. And I think colleagues here in this room will also recall a number of years ago under China's chairship, we had a very large BRICS business fair, which was very successful. And obviously, once international conditions again allow for such events, is something we need to explore. Colleagues, the final
Cyril, 2 minutes more. You have 2 minutes, Cyril.
Thank you, Ambassador. The final point I just wanted to reflect on, I think something that the strategy for BRICS economic partnership does not touch on, which certainly we should explore, is how can the BRICS, who are each relative economic giants in their respective regions, whether that's Latin America, Africa, in Asia, how can we use our regional markets to also pivot our economic cooperation into those markets? I think from where I'm sitting in South Africa, the very obvious opportunity for us as BRICS is the African Continental Free Trade Area. How can we as a BRICS bloc also tap into that, for example, through special economic zones created in South Africa, catering specifically for foreign investors, to then extend our cooperation beyond just the BRICS into our respective regional markets. Ambassador, colleagues, I'm going to leave it there for now, but look forward to further engaging with you on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cyril. I think we will come back to some of those points, as I said. I have great pleasure in requesting, last but not the least, Dr. Nisha Taneja, Professor of the Indian Council Research on International Economic Relations, also known as ICRIER in India, very popular. And Dr. Taneja, you have the mic.
Thank you, Ambassador Kumar. Pleasure to be here with all of you. Since this is a BRICS forum, I thought I'll first begin with trade amongst the BRICS countries. And if you look at the intra-BRICS trade, we find that China paired with South Africa, Brazil, and India accounts for a major share of the BRICS trade, intra-BRICS trade. And the trade between any other pair of countries within BRICS is much less. So this, highlights the fact that it highlights China's centrality in trade within BRICS. If we look at India's trade with BRICS members, again, we find 76% of India's trade is with China alone within the BRICS countries. And overall dependence, if you're looking at India's trade, we find that during the COVID year, India's share of imports from China actually increased by 2%. Now, if you look at foreign investment flows, there's a very interesting trend that we find. Now, here I'm talking only about India. In the COVID year, we find that foreign investment flows actually increased by 15% compared to the previous year. And this was a lot higher than the increase in the previous 2 years, which was only 13%. And what is even more interesting is that 43% of this increase in FDI inflows was into the computer, hardware, and software sector alone. And that's not surprising because there was such a rush towards digitization, which earlier speakers have also mentioned, that the pace of digitization was so fast that it drew a lot of foreign investment into the country. Now, I think I'd also like to, coming to GVCs, I'd just like to touch on what Flavio mentioned earlier about the comparison in gains to economies that are interconnected and localized. Yes, this empirical evidence now more and more is showing that the benefits of interconnected economies is actually more than the localized economies, and also they are less vulnerable than the localized economies. True, this evidence is coming in now more and more. But when we got into the pandemic, the initial reaction of several countries was, and huge incentives were given to businesses to localize. For instance, Japan announced this $2.2 billion package to basically get the Japanese firms to either come back to Japan or to relocalize in other countries. And India also did the same. And we tried to, under the Make in India and the Self-Reliant India banner, we gave a lot of incentives to firms. But I think here it was a little different in the sense that even though we said it was Make in India and it was Self-Reliant India, the core of this policy was to attract foreign direct investment into India. And so I think FDI is a very important component of GVCs, and that's why I'm highlighting this aspect. But here again, I think what we did was we raised tariffs in certain items, and so it now is a challenge to actually calibrate these tariff lines such that they don't really disrupt the GVCs. So these are reactions that came in, and they have posed their own challenges to different countries in the manner that they dealt with the pandemic. India also became a partner to global initiatives on supply chain resilience. For instance, India, Australia, and Japan came together on a resilience initiative, and they're considering possible policy measures that would support enhanced utilization of digital technology and also support trade and investment diversification. Then also under the Quad, we've have a vaccine supply initiative in which we are considering that vaccines be developed in the US, manufactured in India, and financed by Japan, US, and Australia. Now, clearly what's happened is that earlier speakers have also spoken about this, that the trade and investment regimes have failed to address the new challenges that the pandemic has posed. For instance, the existing commitments that we have in international trade and investment agreements don't really deal with any provisions of essential goods and services during a crisis. Also, the flexibility in the bilateral and or regional or multilateral agreements doesn't prevent the use of harmful measures in terms of crisis, and nor is there a review process to remove these measures once they've been imposed. These agreements also fall short on transparency, predictability, and stability. And with this, we also have now new challenges today to be able to have contactless transactions. So the pace of digitization has been enormous, and this itself is posing its own challenges, which need to be addressed. Then we also have a set of contact-intensive industries such as health, education, tourism, and aviation, which now require new regulatory systems to be put in place. And so again, these are new challenges. So clearly, there is a need to revitalize the international trade and investment negotiations, and with the aim of reinforcing a global rules-based environment that can promote investment, innovation, agility, diversification, and sustainability. And that's where the BRICS cooperation really could play a very facilitative role. So what the members can do is to cooperate by contributing to international efforts to expand production of essential medical goods and enhance resilience to health crises. We can also share experiences related to trade facilitating measures that have been put in place in response to the pandemic, with a view to establishing best practices in the context of the crisis. Also, when we've resorted to to export restrictions on essential medical goods, what we can do is actually review these from time to time, and regularly eliminate them as soon as we find that they are necessary. Now, why cooperation is necessary is that even though we can all work together towards improving or strengthening the multilateral trading system.
Dr. Taneja, 2 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Even though we're all, we can all cooperate, it's really very important. These negotiations are going to take years. So that's why cooperation is necessary. And that's why we need to take cooperation very, very seriously. And so we can also cooperate on mapping the layers and elements of supply chain and apply stress tests so that we can actually unbundle these supply chains, identify the weak points or the stress points, and then apply measures, mitigating measures. We can also cooperate on speeding up the trade facilitation agreement commitments, and not just that, we can also cooperate on TFA plus commitments, in the sense that there are so many measures that can go beyond what we have all committed, and because of the digital revolution, the TFA agreement itself is now needs to be revamped, because it doesn't take into account all these new developments. So that's again an area of cooperation. Last but not the least is basically cooperation on regulatory regimes. It's a highly interconnected world, and when we're talking about services, then we have to talk about regulations first. Only then can we actually trade in services. And international regulatory cooperation involves a variety of actors at the national and international level, and it could include lawmakers, regulators across different policy areas, and private standard-setting bodies. So cooperation would be needed on all fronts. It's challenging, but it's possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taneja. I thought you made a set of useful points. We have about 15 minutes left. So if I can raise a couple of provocative points and request the five of you to react to it based on what you have said essentially, and my own contribution, if you like. So the first point I want to make is I want to pick up on something that Dr. Tanya said, which is she listed a 3-point agenda. I'm putting words in your mouth, Dr. Tanya. You may not have exactly said that, but you said cooperation, removal of trade barriers, and trust. This is what you said. And I think that is important. But for me, it is important we apply that to BRICS first before we preach that to the wider world. So charity begins at home. So we will have to do that. Now, in the context of that, I wanted to make 2 points. And as I said, I'll try to provoke you a little bit. The pandemic has devastated our economies. The only exception appears to be China, which is on the path to recovery much earlier than the rest of us. I think that's a fair point to make. So I wanted to ask all of you whether you think BRICS cooperation will be contingent on our economies recovering as fast as possible. So that's the first. Since we are talking about trade and resilient supply chains, we should not be talking in the air. If our economies are going to be devastated and we don't recover quickly enough, and I don't want to get into the economist's nightmare of whether it is a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery or a K-shaped recovery, and this becomes an alphabet soup for a non-economist like me. But whatever way you look at it, is that a valid point to make? And the second point I want to make is that whether we like it or not, the post or during the pandemic, there has been a geopoliticization of trade and investment, whether we like it or not. This is something that is the reality, the geopoliticization of trade. And after all, that is really the origin of resilient supply chains, isn't it? What is the meaning of resilience? Resilience essentially means that partners will have to trust each other in order for us to trade. Otherwise, people don't want to trade without trust. If this is the reality, how do you think the BRICS grouping should go about this? These are the 2 points I want all of you to address. So I will repeat, and you'll have only 2 minutes because that way we will finish by 5:30. I want to accede to my good friend Shubh's dictum that we finish by 5:30. So begin by saying, do we wait for our economies to recover? What can we do? And secondly, how do you restore trust in a world where trade has been highly geopoliticized, in my view? So I'm going to begin with, in the same order, if you don't mind. Miss Olga, would you like to go first, please? Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, it should have been Flavio, right? Flavio, are you ready to go? I don't want to put Miss Olga on the spot. One of you, please.
No problem. I can begin this.
Go ahead, Flavio. Thank you.
Okay. I'm also an economist, so I'll concentrate more on the first part and try to be as brief as possible. Is cooperation contingent on economic recovery? In part, of course, yes, but it is a danger if we just wait for economic recovery in order to restore cooperation, because one of the risks of the size of the disruption in the economies is the possibility that these measures that try to insulate the economies become permanent, and the risk the risk is to countries withdrawing from the global trading system, and this would be a lot more difficult to rebuild. So we should make sure that cooperation begins, that cooperation leads economic recovery and not is led by it. And the cooperation is, of course, among the BRICS, is of course a way to alleviate these concerns of geopolitization of trade and investments, because as you said, we need to build trust in order to trade and to attract investment. So forums like BRICS is, I think it's an important tool in order to create this kind of trust.
Thank you, Flavio. Miss Olga.
Thank you. I also try to be brief, and I totally support the thoughts of Mr. Flavio. And I would like to add that certainly the cooperation is one international cooperation, and especially cooperation between countries with a huge base, pre-pandemic trade and investment base is totally important for internal local recovery, for the recovery of businesses that are oriented on trade, export-import operations. because a lot of our businesses, including small and medium-sized businesses, they are oriented on global value chains and regional value chains. So it is not time to wait. It is time to react and make this process of recovery more smooth through this international cooperation. And as for the second point of politicization of trade and investment, it is really a sensitive issue for Russian economy as well. And I suppose it is bad for, as I said, for businesses. Of course, we have political orientations, some will, and it is, but we also have business interests. We have interests of business community that we should take into account, and some politicization may really make harm in this sphere. So this should be some divided in, especially when we speak about recovery. And as for BRICS countries, I suppose this is the good example of trust and potential of trade and investment that is based on this trust.
Thank you. Dr. Tanya?
Yes, thank you. Me too. I will focus on the first question, as you have mentioned before that China actually recover relatively fast in this pandemic. I would like to share our experiences, and I think the most important one is that when we are waiting for the economy to recover, we have to constantly help the people in need, because we all know this is a very special case. It's a temporary difficulty. This pandemic will not last forever, but for some people, their life just come to a very difficult period, and some of them may not wait for the economy to recover in the future. So the government and our community, we should keep helping those in need to wait for the final success. Second is that as in China case, we always find new opportunities of economic growth. For example, as we know that in city lockdowns and in many pandemic control measures, we cannot gather in supermarkets, we cannot gather in film, like cinemas, but we have also new opportunities like in electronic commerce. If you know that in China, many people live in rural areas, and when the pandemic hits China, they cannot sell their agricultural products. And this is very terrible for them because this is their only income source. And for our case, the farmers, they have relatively low knowledge about internet and online things, but other people help them to sell their products, sell their agricultural products online on living shows, and people from the nationwide can buy their products, and including TV hosts, film stars, and all these celebrities. They help farmers to sell goods. So this is one that people help people, like our BRICS helps BRICS. This is the key one. We have to help each other. And the third one is that to recover economy, we in the waiting period, we make our efforts to lower the cost of like little commerce owners, like house renters, because in our case that everyone that negotiate with each other, like the renter negotiate with house owner, they both agree to just eliminate. Like
you have 1 minute, Dr. Tanya.
Yes,
Thanks.
there's several months rents, and to help each other to go through it, because if the renter broke, then the house owner also cannot have their clients. So we just go backward one step to leave room for both. And to restore trust, I just mentioned one that in this case, everyone is waiting for others to move first, to do something to restore trust. But I think the important thing is that we have to make the first move. So as I mentioned in my talk, that in some cases, we even suggest foreign suppliers first, even we have domestic suppliers. That is to keep our foreign partners, their business, to keep their business live. This is very important. This is a key point to restore our global value chain right after the pandemic. Because if our trade partners, they broke out and they financially broke, when the pandemic has gone, and we also don't have our global value chain, the system is gone. So we have to do something. Yeah, that's my point of view.
Thank you, Dr. Tanya. Mr. Cyril Prinsloo.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those questions. I think maybe just to briefly respond to your first question around economic cooperation. Is it contingent on recovery, as some of our other colleagues have mentioned? Yes, absolutely. I think what we also have to remember, and this is something within BRICS dialogues that really started in 2019 under Brazil's chairship, is showing the tangible results of BRICS cooperation. I think that's important for us to keep that dialogue going, to keep the political commitment. If we can see the tangible benefits of our cooperation, and as my earlier comments suggested, certainly, we saw a strong rebound in trade over the past 18 months, which is testament to our cooperation. On your other question around the geopoliticization of trade, again, I don't think this is something that we just saw in the past 18 months. Obviously, this is something that's been happening, coming along for quite a while. I think the key to maintaining trust, to maintaining the multilateral trade system is to make it work for everyone, right? Where it doesn't work for people, for countries, they tend to break away from the rules. They tend to create subgroupings, whatever. So I think the key for us to keeping that trust, to countering this geopoliticization of trade, is to keep momentum behind the multilateral trading system and reform it so that it works for everyone. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Dr. Taneja, you will have the last word.
I think both cooperation and economic recovery would have to go hand in hand. It's not one or the other. But on economic recovery, what countries can do is basically create an enabling environment. And I think that would be the cornerstone of cooperation also. On cooperation, one important thing is to have a good institutional mechanism for cooperation so that it works and it's not simply a statement. How do we make that work? I think that's a challenge, and how to see it through. So if we have milestones in terms of, this is an area in which we want to cooperate, and we will review it and see how far it's progressed or how it's progressed. That would be simply strengthening this mechanism would be very, very useful in terms of achieving the desired results of cooperation. On trust, I think economics plays a very important role here, which is that if the regimes are transparent, then trust will automatically come in. So there is a whole literature on trust-based trade. So which I think that's what all BRICS countries can aspire for, to have transparent regimes and transparency in whatever we do and share as much information as possible. So we reduce information asymmetries and build in trust. That would lay down the foundation for better cooperation also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to attempt any summary, but I'm just going to close this session by conveying to the powers that be, through the organizers, that the general sense I got is that there is a fundamental utility of keeping the BRICS Forum, especially in the time of the pandemic, to create conditions of trust. And I think the point has been made that governments must be transparent, trade measures must be transparent, governments must create an enabling environment, if you like, and really not wait till the cows come home or the pandemic gets over, but really to keep the momentum of trade, investment, and cooperation going. I'd like to thank you all for your participation and thank both ORF and RIS for organizing this particular seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye, everyone. Great to meet all of you and hear all of you. It was a great session. Thank you, Ambassador Kumar.
Thank you. Thank you.